Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. This is a frontline update for the Ukraine war for the, 16th of February 2023. Let's get straight to the front lines. We'll go to the northeast sector in the Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna front line here. We have some activity going on up in Kupiansk. Let's go to my map. So Kupiansk area, Kupiansk continue to get shelled, but that is under Ukrainian control. Now there's a town called Sinkivka that's just to the north of Kupiansk. There's fighting in the vicinity there, as according to um, ISW, Institute for the Study of War, that is a American think tank, military think tank that aggregates sources from both sides, and you can try and work out what's going on. So apparently, the Russian forces have been mostly. Russian forces have mostly expelled Ukrainian forces from near Sinkivka in fighting there, and that's according to a Russian source. And that the Ukrainian forces are repelling Russian attacks here around Kivka. Okay, so Sinkivka, the claim is that the Russians are saying Ukrainians have been repelled from near Sinkivka, and also fighting in Kherson and further maybe marginal gains there for the Russians. But we go to look at other sources. If we look, for example, at the Rebar, pro-Russian source Rebar, they have said nothing on Twitter, but on Telegram they say the Ukrainian command, in anticipation of an attack in Kupiansk, redeploys military equipment and personnel to the left bank of the Oskil River, which is to say the Oskil River comes down here. The left bank will be I think on this side, I think the river flows in that direction. To then join this Svietsky Donetsk River, so the left bank is on the fighting side of the river, if you like. So, also, Rebar says Russian units are fighting in the vicinity of Sinkivka, engaging the enemy's detected positions. Just trying to work out Sinkivka, because Defmon, for example, has Sinkivka in Russian hands, or at least in the grey zone, but in the Russian kind of area of the grey zone, if you like. And it's had that for a couple of days, but say Deep State Map has Sinkivka in Ukrainian hands. No Reports has Sinkivka firmly in Ukrainian hands there. So just trying to work out exactly what's going on. I think that Russia do not control Sinkivka. I think it's in Ukrainian hands, but they are pushing towards Sinkivka, but fighting around Kivka as well. So as we come further down south, there's not too much detail coming out. If we go to Poulet Volant's map, does nice sort of colourful, clear maps of the front line. We see that the Russians are pushing in just to the west of Svatove in Kolomychika, but the Ukrainians are pushing in Kuzumivka. Not a lot of detail, really, other than that. Just to go back, no report says of where we're just talking about. Sorry, I've jumped ahead too quickly. East of Dvorichna, it is unclear what exactly is going on. I want to wait there for better information before making any changes to the map. The same applies to the surroundings of Svatove, where there is movement, but marginally and not yet worth reporting on. So Dvorichna is this one that's under Ukrainian control. Dvorichne seems to be increasingly under Russian control, and then there's fighting over Kherson. So there is movement around there, but he doesn't want to report on it yet, just wants confirmation. And that's understandable. So if we look at Defmon says, as we go down, so repelled attacks around Kherson, and Kreminna Seversk really goes down towards Kreminna and Nevska there. So nothing about Svatova. So really not a lot of detail about the Kupiansk to Svatova axis. Let's see what Rebar has to say about this area. The Ukrainians are preparing to defend the Makivka, Terny, Yampolivka line. Russian artillery is striking at the crossings, preventing them from entrenching. Ukrainian troops are moving reserves from other directions to prevent the breakthrough of the positions on the left bank of the Zherebets River. Okay, let's put that into context. So if we zoom out a little bit, we have the Oskil River, this darker area there that goes down to Liman. And yes, Izium to the west, and then Liman down here. So you've got the Oskil River, the Sversky Donetsk River that then goes down to Liman. And then from Torsk upwards, you have the Kheribets River that goes up here. So if we put that on the map in blue, you'll understand, where they want to force the Ukrainians back behind, and then they're blowing up sort of bridges and whatnot that allow the Ukrainians to move behind the river and trying to sort of trap them there and then take them out a bit like the Ukrainians did to the Russians in Kherson. So there is a lot of activity going from Ploshchanka down to Dubrova. Kreminna seems to be somewhat safely behind a buffer zone now. No Reports says around Kreminna the fighting's still fierce. Compared to earlier days, it was relatively calm today. North of Dubrova, fighting takes place at distances of up to 30 to 50 meters from each other. South in the forest area, the AFU has a good position. Russian gains are limited. That's to say that the Russians are finding it harder to advance in the forested area and possibly easier to advance north and west of Kreminna. Defmon says the Ukrainians repulsed attacks in the area of Nevska, Kreminna, and Bilorivka. The Russians have made progress west and north of Kreminna the last few weeks, while the Ukrainians seem to be able to hold their positions in the forest southwest of Kreminna more or less. And that's sort of saying the same thing there as Noel reports. Poulet Vallon's next map actually comes down south, but if we talk about uh, up, well, this is south of Kreminna here. You've got Bilorivka holding out here, and there is pressure from the Russians in the forest around the river. And if we go to my map, we can see that, Ploshchanka is attacks towards Nevska, Tierny, Yampelivka. There's lots of pressure, and then down in the forested area, the Russians are finding it a little bit harder. ISW pretty much confirms all that. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces made tactical gains near Ploshchanka, so that's north of Kreminna, and attacked in the direction of Zarichna and Nevska, and the episodic fighting continues near Yampelivka and the Balkazarevka Gully. So that is this sort of gully that I think is basically here in this region between, you've got a gully there and a gully there, and there are heights between those two, and I think it might be just around there that there's fighting. So fighting towards Nevska, Cherny, Yempelivka. I'm going to have a look at my mapping today to really get a handle on this area and what movement there has been. I've been sort of messing around with my maps further south from here, but I have changed it over the last few days to indicate some gains around the forested area and a little bit north here as well. So yeah, the heavy fighting going on in all those areas, if not a huge amount of news to report from there. Russian forces may have made tactical gains in the forested area near Dubrova. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian artillery elements of the central military district have defeated Ukrainian forces near Dubrova and other locations. And multiple Russian mill bloggers have claimed that Russian forces advanced 2 to 3 kilometers from Kreminna in the Dubrova forest and posted pictures of trenches in the forest that the Russians have reportedly recaptured. So these would have been originally Russian trenches. The Ukrainians captured when they were advancing towards Kreminna, and now the Russians are taking them back. So you have seen this, as I said yesterday, the Ukrainians were at the gates of Kreminna almost a couple of weeks ago, and they have been pushed slowly back. But as I said, the Russians are finding it harder in the forest because it's a more difficult environment to fight in. Okay, let's move further down south towards Bakhmut. What do the sources have to say? As we move further down, as you can see from Poulet Vallon's map, there is still pressure going on around Verkhnokamianska, and then from Berestova and up to Rozdilivka and Fedorivka. So that's all pretty normal stuff going on there. And then when we come to Bakhmut, it's a story of Paraskevivka, and it being somewhat surrounded. Uh, let's go and have a look at some pro-Russian sources here. So, Syriac map says situation north of Bakhmut. During the last hours, the Russian army, and this is from yesterday, made significant advances west of Solidar city, reaching artificial ponds and outskirts of Zaliznyanska village. Heavy clashes with the Ukrainians are taking place in the hills north of Berkivka, which will allow Russians to fully encircle Paraskevivka, where their troops continue advancing from the north. Most probably, Ukrainians will withdraw from the town before encirclement is complete. Um, and it carries on. I'm going to talk about that map in a second. In the last few hours, there's been talk of a Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut. This is, in fact, still too early. Only some troops are withdrawing from the eastern areas due to pressure from Wagner's Russian forces and the artillery of the Donbass militia. Interesting, the first time I've seen Syriac mention Wagner for ages. However, the Ukrainian army maintains a strong presence in the streets of the city and still controls an important supply route, which is not likely to fall under Russian artillery control at least the end of next week. The battle for Bakhmut is far from over. In fact, Prigozhin, who's in charge of Wagner, said Bakhmut wouldn't be encircled till um, March, April time. So, of course, March isn't too far away. Syriac Maps talks about gains for the Russians, but annoyingly, for some reason, Syriac Maps in this area seems to flip them 90 degrees, right? So this is north and this is south. I will show you this representation, and you see all the arrows there pointing at like uh, Russian pressure. I'll show you that on my map. Okay, so let's zoom in to the area under the microscope here, which is around the Zalizhnyansky. We've got Solidar here. Uh, that's sorry, Solidar here. Blahadatny, we had, remember, it was fighting over, first of all, Solidar, then the railway line, and then the road. And then behind the road, there are these trenches. Well, these trenches seem to have gone. And now the Russians control all of this land up to this water course that goes down past Zalizhnyansky. The fighting appears to be on the outskirts there. And then we have the M03 or E40 road. Now, Syriac Maps has the Russians having control over some area to the kind of south of that road. Other mappers don't, and they have quite considerable, as you saw from those arrows, which is here. Imagine flipping that. So this is the north, that's the south. Have arrows in all of this area and around Paraskevivka from the north. So Paraskevivka from the north is here. So pressure from there, and then pressure outwards on all of these areas there as they push along to the west. No report says here, in Bakhmut, the situation has not changed. The M03 would be cut off according to Russian sources. This is not the case. In addition, footage appeared of Ukrainian troops re-entering Krasnohora. Footage date is unknown. It's probably old. To my information, Krasnohora is under Russian control. Defmon says situation seems fairly stable. Multiple reports about Krasnohora not being captured, and it seems Magyar confirmed it today. So Magyar is this guy that operates lots of drone activity. He's quite famous now on the socials. Some breathing space have been created north and south of the city. Russian airborne troops are more and more doing the attacking instead of Wagner. So this is the idea that actually Krasnohora might not be completely controlled by the Russians. Indeed, ISW reports on this, saying that geolocated footage published on February the 15th indicates that Ukrainian forces likely hold positions on the western outskirts of Krasnohora. I showed you a picture yesterday that seemed to show Krasnohora, but there's no date to that, just a kind of entrance sign to it from a Ukrainian source. Russian mill bloggers claim that Wagner Group fighters advanced in the southwestern outskirts of Paraskevivka and that they have encircled Ukrainian forces in the settlement, although ISW has not observed visual confirmation of this. And then Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces have cut off a section of the E40 highway from Bakhmut to Sloviansk, and that Ukrainian forces now must use a network of country roads to supply their grouping in Bakhmut from the north. ISW has not observed visual confirmation of Russian forces reaching any section of the E40 that is needed to interdict the Ukrainian ground line of communication between Bakhmut and Sloviansk. And finally, on this area, the Rebar says Wagner PMC groups continue to assault on Paraskevivka from three directions, from Krasnohora, Blahadatne, and Stupki area. At the same time, the offensive in the direction of Bakhmut Sloviansk highway continues. Russian troops are blocking the enemy's possible retreat routes. Okay, let's talk about all of that. So here are the claims that this highway here, the E40 or the M03, has been interdicted. Some Russians are claiming that, and then Ukrainians are denying it, and then some Russian sources, like as Rebar says, uh, the offensive in the direction of the Bakhmut Sloviansk highway continues. So that's in the direction of, rather than actually crossing it. So that's why I've kept my blue line there. There's multiple claims about that highway, but even if it's not been interdicted, that won't be being used. I mean, realistically, it would be far too dangerous, I would have thought. And then sort of claims about Krasnohora. If there's fighting going on here, then you can imagine that the Ukrainians might at some point get back into Krasnohora, fight over a couple of buildings, maybe push back. This will be fairly dynamic, I would have thought. But yeah, exactly what's happening in this area is something of an unknown. As in, it would just be heavy fighting, and yeah, uh, pretty vicious stuff going on there, no doubt. Poulet Volants map shows that. I mean, goodness me, imagine being in Paraskevivka under a lot of pressure there. It has them not going across a highway, but right up to the highway. And then a yellow arrow pushing back in this sort of eastern suburb area of Bakhmut, which is interesting. So on my map, that would be much further down here in the area that is Maximienka Road, which is there now, sort of for some days being controlled by the Russians, but he seems to indicate there is pushback in that area. Let's see what ISW have to say about the eastern and southern areas of Bakhmut. Actually, as I always do, just before I go there, there's just one more source. So this is actually drawing on ISW mapping. So Russian forces have reportedly launched an assault on the town of Berkivka in the north of Bakhmut earlier today. This is more than likely an attempt to cut off Ukrainian defenders that are still holding out near Paraskevivka. So just to let you know where that is, you've got this is the Paraskevivka being surrounded, and this is ISW admitting that there are at least claims of the Russians that they have crossed that highway towards Berkivka. So Berkivka, if I show you on my map, it's probably easier to understand. Berkivka is here. So across this highway, you've got Paraskevivka, you've got Krasnohora, and that ISW map is saying that there are claims that Berkivka is under attack by the Russians. The OSINT defender quite often quite side with the Russians, but the Russians have claimed it. He'll say that is happening. It might well be happening. Not really sure, but there will of course be attempts by the Russians to surround the Ukrainians in Berkivka. Um, Russian channel, just as a general point here, Russian channel has said in Bakhmut direction, the Wagnerites don't have enough ammunition. Seems like the Russian MOD is trying to eliminate this, the Wagner, basically, to take them over. They don't appear to have the ammunition that they need, but then I guess, I'm sure that Ukraine will have similar problems there. So anyway, let's go back to the east and south as I was intending. Just to show you, so south of you got Bakhmut here. We've got around Ivanivska. This is from the 9th of February, just to show you what's happened since the 9th. We're on now the 16th. So this is 1 week of fighting in the area. Have a look at all over, see whether there's any movement. This is according to Deep State Map. And then you're starting to get a little movement north there near Pidorodny. And then starting to see the Ukrainians regain some territory around Ivanivska, some movement there. So a bit of movement. Interestingly, Russians taking some but losing some on the east. And that's on going back to the 4th. So sorry, going the wrong way there. And then as we get nearer to today, not a lot of movement. And then suddenly around Ivanivska, the Russians are being pressured. In fact, the arrow changes direction. So we are seeing that the Ukrainians are pushing back here. Some claims that they're pushing back in the east, but no real firm details. From ISW, accumulating those sources about anything going on in those areas. Right, let's move on to Avdivka. There's Poulet-Volant's southern and eastern Bakhmut map, the two yellow arrows, which is quite a rarity these days on the same map, before we go to the Avdivka map. So as we zoom out and come south, leave Bakhmut behind for the time being, and we come into past Touretsk and to Avdivka. Not a lot to report about Avdivka, apart from there was some footage yesterday of some BMPs getting blown up around there, Russian BMPs. Around Avdivka, says now reports, pro-Ukrainian source, sorry, Russian troops tried to advance after it first fired on Ukrainian defensive positions with incendiary ammunition. The attack was quickly repulsed, according to Ukrainian forces. Sources. The footage today showed two burned out Russian BMPs, possibly as a result of this attempt. Tim White was also reporting that apparently 60 troops, Russian troops, have been lost in the area as well. So I don't know whether that was the same foiled attack there. But other than that, it's the usual sort of Vodyany, Pervomaisky, and so on there. Which is, just to remind you, you've got Vodyany here, where the Russians are trying to push along there, as well as north towards Suverny to try and get this encirclement of Avdivka, while at the same time pushing from Kamyanka and around Krasnohorivka. That Krasnohorivka, there's about three of them around, as well as pushing towards Pervomaisky and down this road. But these long, thin settlements are proving very difficult for the Russians to take. Okay, and then we're going to come down to past another Krasnohorivka, which is just down the road from the previous one, to Marinka, and there's quite a few claims regarding Marinka. Okay, let's go to Suryak Maps, who has some interesting claims about this. So, first of all, actually, that's from the 14th. We have this. So the this is the pig farm that the other day they showed the Russians were hitting with artillery, and now they're claiming the same farm is being hit with Ukrainian artillery, and the geolocation of that farm is here. Okay, so this is this area over there. If we put in that geolocation, this is where it is. There's the pig farm. Okay, so that is the pig farm that is being hit by Ukrainian artillery, which is to say that this is arguably under Russian control. That is certainly what Suryak Maps is claiming here. And if we look at, again, a 90-degree shifted map, annoyingly, in addition, clashes between both sides continue around the tire plant and petrol station. Unable to break Ukrainian defenses at Druzhby Avenue, the Russians are attempting to flank the center from the north and south axis. So here's the south, here's the north. That's the pig farm. And this is a claim that they have taken this area there, that kind of, I guess, phallic area there. And you've got this area in the south where the tire plant they're talking about is. If we look at claims from ISW, they have similar sort of stuff going on about geolocated. So here we have Marinka. Geolocated footage published on the 15th indicates that Russian forces have likely secured marginal advances in the northwest. That's going to be that pig farm. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces changed tactics around Marinka and are now conducting assaults on the settlement from the north and south in an attempt to compel the Ukrainian forces to withdraw from their positions in the western part of the settlement. This change in tactics is unlikely to be any more effective than previous Russian efforts to capture Marinka. However, I would say it's probably, the best thing they could do, to be perfectly frank. Rebar, pro-Russian source, says in Marinka, Russian units advanced towards a tire repairing plant on Chapayeva Street from the south and towards household outbuildings from the north. That's that pig farm. And in Krasnohorivka and Pobyeda areas, Russian armed forces dislodged the AFU from the dominant heights, expanding the bridgehead for further offensive. I haven't seen any sort of other evidence of that. For example, Deep State Map here, the pro-Ukrainian mapping source, has a tiny bit of that area to the south being under Russian control, and this area to the north, sort of what I had, but they haven't got this salient stretched across to the pig farm area there. Okay, so just to let you know, on my map, that's broadly what I have, although I actually have the Russians controlling more of this area just to the west of Druzhby Avenue, to the south of Mariinka. Deep State only have a little bit of this area taken by the Russians, but ISW, Institute for the Study of War, is reflecting some of the that Russian claim you saw in Syrian maps. So geolocated footage published on February the 15th, and again that could well be that Syriac claim, um, uh, uh, or Syriac could be repeating this claim. Geolocated footage published on the 15th indicates that Russian forces have likely secured marginal advances in northwest Marinka, and in fact that's that you know attack towards the pig farm and taking control of the pig farm, and that being hit by Ukrainian artillery now. So, anyway, just to let you know that this is what you have to do to try and work out exactly what's going on, because there's so many different sources saying so many different things, there's so many different mappers saying so many different things. You kind of aggregate them all and try and get a kind of usable, practical average. But it could be that the Russians are certainly further to the west, in the northern outskirts of Marinka, and indeed that would be useful. You would see it as eminently sensible to do a flanking attack. Of this is again a long, thin settlement, and this is why that kind of action would be preferable for them rather than fighting through every street to reach the western outskirts. Which, although Rebar said they'd done that weeks ago, they haven't done that, and they're still in the center. So this is why this area down to the south, called Pobieda, just down here, is important, because that is allowing the Ukrainians to still have control over this kind of area, and that doesn't allow the Russians to easily flank um, Marinka. So that's why Pobieda is always in the news as far as fighting around there. As well as in Marinka itself, but that certainly that northern area is something to look out for over the next few days. Okay, we'll go down to Vuhledar. I've just updated my maps to have a slightly more accurate um, accurate reflection, sorry, of what's going on around Vuhledar. That the Russians seem to control the areas, as you can see in red, so the whole of Pavlivka and then Mikilska, and then moving towards these dachas that have been flattened. Let's have a look and see what sources say. So the ISW says geolocated footage published on the 15th indicates that Ukrainian forces have likely pushed back the Russian forces from positions south and southeast of Vuhledar, but the Russians are still fighting, continuing to conduct offensive operations around Vuhledar, but that open terrain around the settlement is making Russian advances difficult. Okay, Defmon just has, fighting around Vuhledar. Tatragami, who's a really good source for Vuhledar, says this: the situation in the Vuhledar area remains stable. However, the enemy doesn't seem to reduce the pressure despite losses. The tactics remain the same, advancing infantry groups covered by tank and artillery fire. The armored vehicles are used for the cover, delivery, and evacuation of infantry. The enemy actively uses tanks from closed positions, while sheer numbers of enemy artillery suppress our artillery, allowing the groups to move closer. Alongside infantry reinforcements, the enemy continues to saturate the area with the additional artillery. To improve their tactical situation, Russian assault groups attempt to establish a foothold near Vuhledar, albeit with no results. Despite the overwhelming numerical advantage of Russian occupational forces, Ukrainian forces, in the area demonstrate superiority. A big role in it was played by the successful implementation of elements of the Western NATO-like governance system, Mission Command. Unlike the foe, Ukrainian soldiers and officers can make necessary changes and determine the best course of action on the battlefield based on judgment, initiative, and creativity. This is far superior system that needs to be indoctrinated more. Sadly, this is not always the case in the armed forces of Ukraine, as it's not easy to get rid of the Soviet-style command system entirely. A small Soviet army can't defeat a large Soviet army, which is why we need to emphasize the decentralized approach. A really interesting uh, evaluation there is kind of what we've heard a lot during the course of this war. In my next little update, he says I'll provide a few examples to demonstrate why this approach works better and how the combination of Western weaponry and a Western approach can ensure better outcomes for us in this war. Absolutely, uh, yeah, really interesting there. So this is the idea that the Russians are just doing the same thing over and over, just sending in waves of attack. They're not making any kind of decisions, reactive decisions based on decentralized command structures. It's just a centralized order to take Vuhledar by the same means, and they just do that over and over. They're being beaten back by a smaller, more dynamic force that is able to use that kind of decentralized command structure along with Western weapons to keep the Russians at bay. So that is essentially what's happening in Vuhledar still. Um, uh, Yeah, as we come out of there, the Russians are making huge losses. We'll look at the wider um, uh, situation um, in Zaporizhia. Interestingly, Syriac Maps said that they've adjusted some mapping around their map around, where was it? It was around Novo. Yeah, here it is around here. So they had got some of their mapping wrong, and actually, Ukrainians held more territory around here than they had thought. But actually, it doesn't make too much difference. It's pretty much what my map said anyway. Let's have a look to the ISW to see what they say about the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson. Not much to report, just routine sort of fire across the front lines. But in the Kherson area, this is fairly interesting. Russian sources implied that Ukrainian forces may hold positions on the left bank of the river, Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. The Russian sources implied the Ukrainians may. So let's go and look at. Oh, sorry. Actually, my map's probably better for this. This is to say that as we come towards the west, that there might be some areas on the eastern bank here that Ukraine have control over. Um, a Russian mill blogger amplified footage on February the 15th of a correspondent from the Russian outlet Izvestia claiming to be 1 kilometer from Ukrainian positions in an unspecified settlement in the Kakhovka reservoir area. The correspondent claimed that Russian forces pushed Ukrainian forces out of half of this unspecified settlement during a reconnaissance in force operation 2 weeks ago. Russian and Ukrainian forces are reportedly continuing to engage in reconnaissance activities and small scale skirmishes in the Dnipro River Delta. Um, and there you go. So ISW has not had any confirmation that Ukrainians hold positions on the east bank of the Dnipro. But that would be interesting if that was the case, and that's using evidence from the Russians themselves. Anyway, that brings me to the end of the Frontline update. Please like, subscribe, and share. I hope this was useful to you. There's obviously usual HIMARS attacks going on all over the shop, with command and control centers and troop accumulations being hit on a nightly basis. So don't think the HIMARS aren't doing their thing. But anyway, yeah, I'll check you out later for the Ukraine war update extra video that will give you those juicy nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war. Please check that out. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.